Catalina. Let's see if we have a good question from Catalina. Otherwise, we can take a question for Rakan first, who yes, and we'll be facilitating this session with Faustin in turn. So let's see, we have good amount of questions coming. So the first, well, actually, just to start with, Catalina, maybe if you have questions to each other's presentations, or if Catalina, if you have a comments regarding Bernadette's, Alan's, and Rakan's presentations.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to all the speakers. I think these were excellent presentations, very insightful on the different uses of technology, and a lot of good questions from the panel and from the participants themselves in following up on these presentations. I had a specific question for Rakan. I think that the presentation was very useful, in particular to look at the benefits that that the drone technology is offering, but also some of the limitations. One specific question I had to do with the legal aspects and any potential conflicts that have arisen based on your experience or just the use of drones, in particular with some countries where regulation, for example, at the state level that prohibits drone use, but in other areas where the conflicts could arise from the protection of personal data vis-a-vis landowners. So I wanted to hear your views on the legal implications. And for the other presenters, I think in general, one key point I noticed is the diversity of the use of the technologies, and in particular with the exception of Alan, where the focus was on environmental and ecological aspects and how to leverage further information on variables to that end. With regard to the other technologies, how could we supplement indicators to address more of the social environmental aspects, and what you advise or what you recommend in that regard that could be explored to broaden and complement some of the initiatives you're working on with some of the priorities at the global and of course national and local levels. Thank you.
So first I would like to hand over to Rakan, Catalina's first question. How to proceed in areas where regulations or protection of data complicates the use of drones? Rakan, feel free to answer this.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Catalina, for the question. I've only actually worked with drones in Costa Rica, so my direct knowledge in terms of regulations apply to that country only. When we did this study, there were no regulations on drones, so there was no issue. But since that time, the government has drafted restrictions, but as far as Costa Rica goes, they're fairly simple. So basically, the restrictions apply to anywhere that there are airports. There's a height limit, but it's pretty generous, and that's it. Actually, the regulations are, I think, 1 or 2 pages, so it's a pretty simple form. Obviously, U.S. and other countries have a different set of criteria, and each country is going to be is approaching this separately, largely. So some countries have much more restrictive regulations. The use of drones grew exponentially, mostly for leisure use, and I think caught governments off guard. So a lot of governments scrambled to get legislation in to try and put in, regulations for safety and so on. But I think that really depends on the country you work in, and one would need to look at that specifically before using drones in a particular area.
Thank you, Rakan. That's interesting. I understand Catalina asked also a second question. I'm not sure if question number 2 is now written as to paraphrase that, how to complement indicators. Or Catalina, if you want to, okay, now, according to you, what are the main challenges in using these tools, for example, drones or the citizen observatories, for monitoring forest and landscape restoration? How have you overcome these challenges in your work? Now I know this is not the question Catalina asked, but let's go in order. I noticed that Bernadette might have been cut off at this point, so I hand over to Alan if you want to elaborate on the challenges briefly, and then we go to Catalina's question.
I think the main challenge at the moment, as far as citizen observatories are concerned, is to make the transition from citizen observatories organized by scientists and by the European Commission to citizen observatories that are self-started by citizens according to what their needs actually are. And the forest and landscape restoration community could make an important contribution to this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alan. So let's go further to ask at least 1 or 2 questions from Rakan as his question and answers. So here we have, what area do you consider safe as a maximum to fly using a drone? Saying that you already showed something like 2-3 hectares in 15 minutes. What is the maximum time that the drone can fly, and can you adapt a LiDAR sensor in the drone? That's the second part of the question.
Yeah, those are good questions. So drones, the size of drones that we worked with, which are basically the typical drone you see people flying in many places. Those have a battery life time of about 15 to 25 minutes maximum. So the area you can cover in that time frame is about 2 to 3 hectares. Some drones can fly faster, and you can obviously take more images per second now, depending on the type of camera you have. So you could conceivably cover a few more hectares than that. But those are just for hexacopter drones. So there are drones that use different that fly differently, and then you can cover tens of hectares or even hundreds of hectares using the same methodology. And I've seen, I haven't worked with them myself, but I've seen they're sort of like little airplanes as opposed to helicopters and hexacopters, and so you can cover a lot more area that way. The LiDAR is an excellent question, and I know that there was a study looking at that in Costa Rica and La Selva. Because of the weight, you have to use a bigger drone, so the costs start going up a lot more. So instead of spending $1,000 on a drone that you can use to fly and capture digital imagery, you're talking about something with a lot more capacity to lift weight, and so the price is a lot higher, but it is possible.
All right, excellent, good to know. So LiDAR and drones can be compatible. How about the drone monitoring in natural tropical dense forest? So this is again for Rakan, if we can get a brief answer to that, and then we go ahead for the questions also for other speakers.
Sure. So the dense forest issue is one weakness of this technology. So at the end of the day, your drone is actually just taking pictures, right? So a photograph is not going to penetrate a canopy, but the way structure from motion software works is when you have a little gap in the canopy, that image, and you take multiple angles of that little small gap in the canopy, those images when they're stitched together and you come up with a 3D model, you can see that little gap down there, and you can use that little space to come up with basically your ground digital terrain model. Now, if you have a really, really dense canopy with no tree falls and few gaps, then you're really going to have a hard time coming up with a digital terrain model. So one way to get around that is to, if you have access to a digital terrain model that was taken with a LiDAR, that only needs to be done once, right? Because your ground layer is never going to change in theory. Then you can fly drones as many times as you want, and you don't really, it doesn't matter how dense the canopy cover is because you'll still get a top layer. I hope that, I don't know if that makes sense, but feel free to ask
Yes.
clarification.
No, that's really, that clarifies a lot. Thank you.